Do you like classics, but you're tired of getting the same old recommendations of the mainstream classics everyone has heard of? Well, what about if I told you I found what's largely considered the world's first mummy novel, or the world's first classic detective novel? Or did you know that the Bronte sisters, Charlotte and Emily, had another sister who was also a published author? I've got 13 lesser known, a bit more obscure classic books to share with you and suggest in today's video. Hey there, it's Anna and Tucker, and we hope you're having a great day. Like I said in the intro, today I am going to share with you 13 more obscure classics that you might want to consider reading. And I think some of these choices are really fascinating. Fascinating to me anyways. I didn't really know most of these existed until I started doing some research. So let's get into it. The first one is by an author you've definitely heard of. You just may not have heard of this title. And it is The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker, who is also the author of Dracula. The Jewel of Seven Stars was a later novel published after Dracula was published. It was published in 1903, and it wasn't nearly as well received as Dracula was, and so it didn't gain nearly the popularity that Dracula did. However, this novel is largely considered the world's first mummy novel, by which all other mummy type supernatural novels and mysteries have kind of sprung from, much the same way that Bram Stoker is credited for kind of bringing the vampire genre to life, which, interestingly enough, Bram Stoker was not the first person to write about the gentlemanly type vampire. There's actually an earlier work that I'm going to reference at the end of this video that is actually the real work that's considered the origin of the gentleman aristocratic vampire. So stay tuned for that one. That one's going to be last on my list. But back to this one. Like I said, this novel is largely considered the world's first mummy novel. And so in this one, a mummified queen tries to become reanimated, wake up from the dead, and is trying to gain power and eternal life. And we've got a group of people who are actively trying to figure out how to make sure she does not actually attain her goal. And the funny thing about this book is that I'd never heard of it before I did some research for this video, but it is largely cinematic in setting and character and plot, and so it lends itself very well to film and TV adaptations. And in fact, there have been several film and TV adaptations over the years. None of them are called the title of the book. They're all called something different, and so you wouldn't know right off the bat that the origin of the story is actually a book written by Bram Stoker. Now, I haven't read this book, but I did read the first chapter and I read the introduction, which was fascinating, by the way. I learned so many things about Bram Stoker I had no idea at all about. But the first chapter is very good, and so it's definitely on my list to finish someday soon, as soon as I worked my way through this list back here. We'll see how long that takes. But this book was difficult to find, and as are most of the books that are on my list. I went to the library, I tried to find these books. Only 2 of these books were found in my local library system of like 15 libraries. So if you're wondering how obscure and difficult these are to obtain, at least as far as libraries go, pretty difficult. They're not your average classic. All right, what's your interest level in reading a novel that's largely considered one of the greatest mystery novels ever written. Is it pretty high? I love mysteries. So I was quite intrigued to find out that The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins is considered one of the world's best mystery thrillers ever written. The Woman in White was originally published as a serialization in a periodical run by Charles Dickens. The Woman in White appeared in these periodicals from about November of 1859 to August of 1860 and was then published as a book shortly after that. This novel is credited as kind of the origin novel of creating a new genre called sensational fiction. And that's a genre that continues to this day. So the sensational part, I think, is like the thriller portion of this novel. The Woman in White is dominated by two of the finest creations in all Victorian fiction. Marion Halcombe, dark, mannish, yet irresistibly fascinating, and Count Fosco, the sinister and flamboyant Napoleon of crime. Full of surprise and suspense, this vastly entertaining novel continues to enthrall readers today. And I was quite surprised when I picked this novel up and discovered just how long it is. It is a little over 600 pages. It kind of makes sense because it was serialized, and so, you know, it's kind of hard to keep track of page numbers when you're just printing, you know, every chapter or every couple of chapters. In a periodical, you're not keeping track. But this was one of the two books that I was able to find in the library, but it is still considered a bit more obscure than a lot of other classic works are. All right, the next obscure classic that I have to share with you is one of the most fascinating ones on this list, for me anyways. It is a novel by Jules Verne, the same author that wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Journey to the Center of the Earth. These well-loved novels. He's known for being a pioneer in science fiction and kind of futuristic type novels, right? Well, did you know that there was a new Jules Verne novel never published before that was published in 1994, literally for the first time? Now, this novel is considered Jules Verne's very first manuscript that he ever wrote. It was written in 1863, and it was never published. And in fact, he did send it off to see if someone wanted to publish it, but at the time, his publisher said, nobody is going to believe this. This novel is too fantastical. In fact, a direct quote from the rejection letter says, "No one today would believe your prophecies." Well, that novel is called Paris in the 20th Century, and it is known as the lost novel because, again, it was lost for over 100 years. And the story behind finding this manuscript is also very fascinating. So in 1989, one of the Verne family homes in France needed to be sold. And in the process of getting the house ready to be sold, Jules Verne's great-grandson discovered a bronze chest that had never been opened. It was locked, they didn't have the key, and they largely thought that there was nothing inside of it, but decided that they should open it anyways. So they got a blowtorch and they opened it up. And under some cover of linen, they found the manuscript for this book, Paris in the 20th Century. And they sent it off to be authenticated. It was in fact authenticated as a Jules Verne original. The rejection letter was also somewhere in the chest, and they decided to publish it because it was a novel written in 1863 about what Paris might be like in the 1960s. So now we're in 1989, and as you read this book, you realize Jules Verne was a bit of a prophet. He got a lot of it right. He got a lot of it wrong, but a lot of the things in this book are fairly accurate, and it is astonishing how close he got to reality. And so this novel follows a man in 1960s Paris. I haven't read the entire book, but I have read a little bit of the first chapter, and I did read the entire introduction, which was fascinating to me. In fact, most of these books have very in-depth introductions that are like 20 or 30 pages long themselves, and they are fascinating if you want to know the story behind the author and the book and kind of the author's journey. I highly recommend getting versions with introductions in them. But anyways, brand new Jules Verne novel that was just published 30 years ago. So I thought I would pick it up and see what I thought. Had you heard of this novel? Did you know that this was published only 30 years ago? Let me know in the comments if you have heard of the lost novel Paris in the 20th century or not. All right, so next on the list of obscure classics, I asked earlier in the video, did you know that there was a third Bronte sister who was also a published novelist? So we've got Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre, and we've got Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights. Both very, very, very famous and well-loved Victorian novels, classics. But they had a younger sister, and her name was Anne Bronte, and she had a couple novels published as well. In fact, her novels were published as a package deal with her other two sisters' novels, Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. Now, the novel that I'm about to suggest was not the one that was published as part of this triple deal. It was published, I think, later. Her first novel that was published, I believe, is called Agnes Grey, as part of the triple deal. But I chose a different one that I think has better reviews. They're both honestly fairly obscure though. But I chose The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and this is by Anne Bronte. This novel was originally published under the pseudonym of Acton Bell in 1848. The Bronte sisters, when they were first published, they all published under pseudonyms. They were not female, they were male, and they all carried the last name of Bell. They thought that it was, kind of a protective mechanism. Emily was very shy. She actually didn't want any of her writings published. Her sisters kind of pushed her to publish with them, and Charlotte didn't really want people to know her work because she was a little bit unsure, right, of putting her heart and soul out there. And so, for numerous reasons, they all published under pseudonyms, later then published under their real names. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was very controversial at the time that it was published, and it's probably why it remained largely obscure, and still remains obscure really to this day. It was very controversial at the time because it explores themes of gender, marriage, and societal expectations, and it kind of was known as a bit of a feminist novel, like if you have to put it in a category. Anne was very kind of outspoken about showing a different side of marriage. It wasn't this idyllic kind of life, and she's got a very strong heroine who has to deal with a husband who is an alcoholic, who has other kind of problems, and a lot of scholars believe that the problems that are talked about in this novel are based off of her experiences with their brother named Branwell Bronte, who was I think the second eldest child. Apparently there were 6 Bronte children in total. The first 2, the eldest 2, died. They didn't make it out of adulthood. And then you've got Charlotte, Emily, Branwell, and Anne, I believe. I might have Emily and Branwell mixed up, but I know that out of the 4 that survived to adulthood, Charlotte was the oldest and Anne was the youngest. Branwell had a lot of problems. He never really got a career going. He was an alcoholic and might have had issues with using other types of drug-type substances, and he carried on an affair with a married lady for quite a while, and so he wasn't the best role model. A lot of scholars figure that Anne kind of used his life as inspiration for her characters in this particular novel. But I've heard good things about this one, and I really love Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. It's written in a similar style. People say that it's not as good as the other ones, but good enough to be published. So let me know, have you read this one? What do you think in comparison to the other Bronte novels? Speaking of the Bronte sisters, did you know that Charlotte Bronte wrote more than just one novel? Her most famous novel is Jane Eyre. She's got another fairly famous novel called Villette. Haven't read that one. But she wrote a few others as well. These are lesser known. So I chose one of the lesser known novels to suggest to you, and that is Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. Shirley is the title of a woman of independent means. That is what Shirley means. So again, all of Charlotte's novels originally were printed under a pseudonym. I forget what her first name was, but it was all, the last name was Bell. This was first published in 1849, and it was published after Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was Charlotte's first novel. And so again, this one is less popular because people didn't like it quite as much as Jane Eyre and Villette. I think more people liked those better, and so those didn't kind of get relegated to obscurity. But this novel is quite interesting. It's a historical romance set in Yorkshire in the early 1800s, 1811, 1812, something like that. And it is set amongst the Luddite movement and the Napoleonic Wars. It challenges societal expectations while challenging social justice and intertwining not one but two love stories into the same novel. And so this is considered a historical romance novel. Not as good as Jane Eyre, supposedly. I haven't read this. It is on my list because Jane Eyre is one of my favorite novels, but I think it's worth a read for sure. I mean, if this thing is still being published, 130 years later, it's probably pretty good. So the next novel on my list is probably one of the less obscure as far as obscurity goes on my list. I think what makes it obscure is that it's not a really well-known author, not nearly as popular as, let's say, Dickens or someone like that. However, it is a very good novel in its own right, and it is at least popular enough to be a good selection for AP English classes if you happen to be taking an AP English test anytime soon. And that novel is The Awakening by Kate Chopin. So Kate Chopin had kind of made a name for herself by writing several short stories. When The Awakening was published in 1899, it was largely considered to be too sordid and too immoral by critics to, be hailed a success. And so it actually damaged Chopin's integrity as an author, and she was never really able to quite recover. The Awakening is about a young wife and mother who, under tragic circumstances, refuses to be caged by married and domestic life and claims for herself moral and erotic freedom. And so this is largely considered a feminist novel, and because it was, quite outspoken for what it was relegated to obscurity for quite a while. But in recent years, it has gained popularity as an important novel that showcases kind of what a hard life it was to be a woman in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you didn't have a lot of choices, and but women are still beings with feelings and, desires of our own. And this was one of the first novels to kind of like paint that picture. So it is a short read. This book has other Kate Chopin short stories in it as well. So this isn't the entire, novel. I think it's like more of a novella. It's like 100 pages, maybe 120 pages, something like that. It's pretty short. All right. There is one author that has 2 books that appear on this list, actually. And I think in general, I feel like the author is obscure to me in general. But that author is Wilkie Collins and his novel, The Moonstone. So The Moonstone was first published in 1868, and T.S. Eliot famously described The Moonstone as, quote, "the first, the longest, and the best of modern English detective novels." This novel is largely credited as being one of the first modern detective novels to be written and published. And so a lot of the detective novels that came after this particular one, even into modern times today, kind of follow the same format that this novel pioneered back in the mid 1800s. And so this novel is about a girl who, on her 18th birthday, receives a priceless yellow diamond that was looted from an Indian temple. On the same night that she receives this diamond, it's stolen again, except from her this time. And so the story that's told is the detective case where they're trying to figure out who done it. And so this is one of the very first, if not the first, whodunit classic mysteries that we love today. This is the novel that pioneered the way for that. So if you're interested, check this one out. The next novel I want to tell you about is the youngest novel of all the ones in this list. It was published in 1956, so less than 100 years old, but still pretty old. It is by a famous author, but it is a much less famous work. In fact, it's one of his most obscure works. And the author is C.S. Lewis, and the book is Till We Have Faces. This book is a retelling of the Greek myth between Cupid and Psyche, told from Psyche's older sister's perspective. And so this one is more obscure than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and that whole series, or even some of his more Christian writings, because the themes and the messages of this book aren't exactly floating on the surface like they are in some of his other more well-known works. And so in order to get to the heart of this particular novel, it is a little more complicated, and thus it kind of got relegated to obscurity. But it is known for being one of the best retellings of this particular myth. And again, this book was hard to find. Most of these, like I said, I looked in the library for this. I thought, oh, C.S. Lewis, he's a really popular author. I'll probably be able to find it. No, all I really found was various books from the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series, and a few other books that were like more mainstream Christian books. But this one, nope. I had to buy this one off of Amazon. Oh, also, side note, I even went to Barnes & Noble to look for some of these books, and I couldn't find a single one in Barnes & Noble, and I have a pretty big Barnes & Noble near me. And so I was pretty astonished that I had to look really hard for these books. I was able to get them all on Amazon, which has a much larger warehouse, but still very difficult to find. I mean, the only Bram Stoker book I could find was Dracula, and he wrote like 5 books. So just to give you an idea that yes, these books are a little more difficult to find. Yes, you can get them on Amazon, but not everybody has Amazon Deliver, and so these might be a little harder to obtain. All right, now the next novel I think many would argue is not exactly obscure, and that's fine. You're probably right, but I have never read this author, and so the author is a bit obscure to me. I have heard of some of this author's other works, just not this one that I'm about to tell you about. And the book is Far from the Maddening Crowd by Thomas Hardy. So I think I've heard vaguely of Thomas Hardy, but I've never read a Thomas Hardy novel, and maybe I've heard the title, but I didn't realize it was a book, something to that effect. But Thomas Hardy also wrote Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is a far more popular novel. In fact, that one was at my local library, but this one wasn't. So, you know, I don't know how obscure you want to make that, but there were a lot of Thomas Hardy books. Not this one, though. This book was first published in 1874, and it was Thomas Hardy's fourth novel, but it is considered the first of his great novels that he ended up writing. So all of the other ones that have a little more notoriety even than this one were published after this one. This story is about a spirited young woman who inherits a large farm in England and attracts 3 suitors. This is a love story. It's a romance novel. It's filled with swift passion and slow courtship, imbued with evocative descriptions of rural life with unflinching honesty about sexual relationships. Again, this is a novel with another fascinating history. Thomas Hardy was a well-connected author during that time, as most of these were. And so again, the introduction to this one is fascinating to read. All right, the next book on my list, I have to say, the description is what got me. And this is a more obscure work, for sure. It is The Life and Opinions of the Tomcat Murr by E.T.A. Hoffman. This was originally published as a serialization in another periodical from 1820 to 1822. This is German romance literature, and so it was originally written in German. It's been translated into English. And this book, and this author in particular, influenced later authors such as Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Dickens, Emily Bronte and Wuthering Heights, and Franz Kafka. This book, the premise of this book is a bit crazy. It's about a self-taught cat who writes his own autobiography, but due to a printing mistake, his autobiography kind of gets spliced and mixed up with a book about a composer. And so the way that this book is constructed is like you get some of Tomcat Murr's life for a while, written from his perspective, cat who writes books, and then for a while you get some of this composer's life and back and forth. And so what you end up with is a very humorous, odd book. It is quoted as being one of the strangest books to have ever been published in the 19th century. But apparently it's very comedic and very funny, and the structure is a little difficult to get used to, but apparently it's all worth the payoff, and the book is fantastic. And so this one seems really, really fascinating to me, and I am excited to read it at some point when I need some sort of comic relief in my life, I guess. All right, I've got 3 more books to talk about. The first one is maybe not that obscure. I don't know. I'd never heard of it before, but also I'm not super into Gothic horror. But with these last few books, we are going to get into the origins of where kind of the modern day horror story came from, with some Gothic horror that kind of paved the way for modern horror, supernatural, ghosty type stories to flow from there on. And so the first book I'm talking about is The Castle of Orronto by Horace Walpole. This book was first published in 1764, so this is the oldest book, I believe, on this list, and it was the first supernatural English novel and is one of the most influential works of Gothic fiction. It inaugurated a literary genre that will forever be associated with the effects that Walpole pioneered. Professing to be a translation of a mysterious Italian tale from the darkest Middle Ages, the novel tells of Manfred, Prince of Otranto, whose fear of an ancient prophecy sets him on a course of destruction. After the grotesque death of his only son, Conrad, on his wedding day, Manfred determines to marry the bride-to-be. The virgin Isabella flees through a castle riddled with secret passages. Chilling coincidences, ghostly visitations, arcane revelations, and violent combat combine in a heady mix that terrified the novel's first readers. And so again, this novel is important because it is the origin of Gothic horror and all of those things. And the introduction of this book in particular is fascinating. It is very, very interesting to kind of walk the path of how you got from this book to all of the modern day horror that is now out there. Speaking of Gothic fiction and kind of the origin, the next book I have is also considered a pioneer in Gothic fiction, and that is The Monk by Matthew Lewis. Again, there are mixed opinions about how obscure this particular book is, but I'm not too familiar with Gothic horror, Gothic fiction, classic Gothic fiction, so obscure to me. This one was published in 1796, and it was savaged by critics for its supposed profanity and obscenity, and bought in large numbers by readers eager to see whether it lived up to its lurid reputation. And so this book is about a monk who succumbs to the charms of a young girl who comes to the monastery disguised as a boy. And the monk continues a descent into increasingly depraved acts of sorcery, murder, incest, and torture. Combining sensationalism with acute psychological insight, this masterpiece of Gothic fiction is a powerful exploration of how violent and erotic impulses can break through the barriers of social and moral restraint. The introduction for this book is also fascinating because it talks a lot about the Castle of Orronto as being kind of an inspiration for this book, and it talks about this book being an inspiration for future novels down the road that are also considered classic Gothic horror. So if you're into Gothic horror, Gothic fiction, these the previous book, The Castle of Orronto and The Monk, are fantastic places to start. And the last book that I want to share with you is probably one of the more obscure books on this list. It's actually not really a book. I would say it's more of a short story, but it's a very important work as far as its influence, and that is The Vampire, spelled with a Y, by John Polidori. So this book also has 13 other short stories in it, so that's why it's as big as it is. The vampire story itself is only about 22 or 23 pages, but it was originally published in a magazine in 1819, and it was actually originally attributed to Lord Byron. The story behind where this short story comes from is really interesting. If you're not familiar, there was a short story kind of competition between Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, who at the time was not Mary Shelley, she was whatever her maiden name is, I can't remember what it is right now, and a few other writers, and they were all kind of grouped together in Switzerland in Lake Geneva. And during this ghost writing competition, that is where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and that's where it came from. So from that same competition, we also got this story, The Vampire. And so when it was written down and sent to a publisher as like a little package, the publisher mistook the writings as Lord Byron's writings, who at the time was a world famous author. It was very, very popular at the time. It seemed much like his style, and so originally it was published and attributed to him. But when he saw that, he said, "Oh no, I didn't write that. John Polidori wrote it." He said that he contributed ideas to the story, but the story was not his. And so the reason this story is so important is because there had been previous vampire tales told before this one, but the main difference was that those vampire stories kind of made vampires be crude, kind of low-life monsters. The aristocratic vampire had not been invented yet. The vampire, this one, is actually the first instance of an aristocratic gentleman vampire. And so because it was so short, I did actually read this one, and it is quite good. It is about a young man who is a companion to a lord. But this lord is very odd. He's got odd mannerisms. He seems to kind of cheat people out of a lot of things, and the young man can't figure out how. But they're traveling around the world together. Eventually, the young man gets several warnings from various friends and family saying, "The lord that you are traveling with is not a good guy. There is something mysterious and supernatural about him. You need to break away from him." And so the young man does. He then breaks away from the Lord without really saying why, and the Lord doesn't give him too much fuss over it. And they part ways, and so the young man makes his way to Greece. When he's in Greece, he does some work, but he stays with a family, and this family has a young maiden who he ends up kind of falling in love with. But he never really declares himself. And then one day he goes into the woods, and these woods, everybody tells him not to go into these woods after dark. There are tons of superstitions. Bad things will happen to you. He doesn't listen. And then eventually something bad happens to his young maiden, and he is depressed. And wouldn't you know it, his old companion and friend shows up to care for him. And then the guy gets shot. And just as the guy is dying and the young man has recovered, he says, "Promise me that you won't tell anybody that I have died for 1 year and 1 day. Swear on your life that you will keep this secret." And the young man, wanting to grant his companion's last wishes, says, "Okay." And some other stuff happens. If I tell you everything that happens, it'll ruin this story. But it's very entertaining, and I can see where the beginnings of the modern day vampire come from. So this story was written before Carmilla. This story was written before Dracula, but of course Dracula is the most infamous and is largely credited with, the birth of the modern day vampire. But the history behind the vampire story goes much further back and is far more fascinating. And so while I was doing the research on these particular books, I was kind of wondering if anybody is also interested in me kind of doing a deep dive into the history of vampire books, and maybe like finding a chronology and maybe comparing some of the vampire stories that we attribute to kind of the modern day vampire stories. Where did it all originate from? Something like that. If that kind of video sounds interesting to you, let me know, and I would be happy to do it if I get enough interest there. So that's it. Those are the 13 more or less fairly obscure classics that I want to recommend that you pick up. They are not your average everyday run-of-the-mill A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations recommendations. I think a lot of these novels have their own importance, even though many of them have been relegated to obscurity. A lot of them seem really worth reading and potentially far more interesting than the classics that get a lot more notoriety. Let me know in the comments which of these 13 sounded most interesting to you. Have you heard of any of these? Have you read any of these? Let me know. I plan on reading most of these because I had to purchase most of them in order to do this video. So this video was a bit of a haul on top of a book list recommendation. You got a twofer this time. If you liked this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to my channel. I always appreciate the support, and I love interacting with you guys in the comments and seeing what you guys have to say. So say hi, let me know what you think. I'd love to know. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.